Okay, welcome back, everyone. We're on now to our second speaker, who is Professor Emmanuel Igah. He's a native of Nigeria, professor of geopolitics and international business at the IPAG Business School in Paris. He's a multi-award-winning author, has over 50 publications, and well over 30 years of research and teaching experience across the world. He will be discussing decolonizing the African mind, which is one of the critical levers of building the Africa that we all desire. Professor Igah, you have the floor. Thank you.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Let me join the chorus to say Happy Africa Day to Africa. This is a very rich program that we have, and the topic that has been given to me to discuss is a particularly exciting one. I think this is the kind of topic I'm sure everybody on the platform has an idea, has an opinion, has an approach to, and I'm sure my role therefore would be like to just say a few words and then leave the rest to the interaction that will take place afterwards. I'll be looking at key questions like why and how has the decolonization issue come up? And what are the scopes and forms and ramifications of colonization of the mind today? Then I'll try to conclude with some ideas about how I think we should move forward with the full emancipation of the mind. How and why has this decolonization question come up? Of course, when you talk of decolonization, that implies that there has been colonization. It means colonization has taken place. I looked at the dictionary to see what this colonization thing is about. I looked at the Cambridge Dictionary, and I was a little bit frustrated to find the definition that was given, which is the act of sending people to live in and govern another country or territory. Of course, this definition is very incomplete and biased. It doesn't, for example, talk about the force that is used to conquer and dominate territories and their populations. Well, of course, it's not only Africa that has suffered colonization. It's practically something that has occurred everywhere in all the regions of the world at different times in history. Most of the time, it's countries that are more powerful, that are trying to expand their, what we call in geopolitics, their vital space. That the vital space contains the resources that the powerful country needs. And so they expand to reach out and conquer these territories so that they can exploit these resources for their own benefits. That is the driving force in colonization. Of course, we do have two types of colonial experiences that we can say African continent went through. Most of the time when we're talking about colonization, people are looking at what happened between Africa and the European powers. But of course, before the European powers came, Africa had also experienced a kind of Arab settler colonialism that took place, first of all with the occupation of Egypt and its Islamization, and then it spread across the whole of North Africa, and then went downwards towards West Africa, which was already in progress at the time that the European colonization started. The European colonization wasn't necessarily the colonization, as historians would call it, today. It started with what we call the slave trade, which held sway from the 16th to the 19th centuries. Of course, the slave trade prepared the ground for the colonization of Africa that took place later, which was formalized by the Berlin Conference that took place in 1884, during which African continent was practically distributed, shared, like a cake, using knives to cut, and Africa was partitioned, basically between the major powers of Europe. They were Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Italy, Spain, and Portugal. Well, Ethiopia probably was the only country that was not subdued, even though parts of its territories were captured by Italy. Well, one of the driving forces of this colonization that started taking place in the second half of the 19th century, let me say very formally, after the slave trade, was that, well, the Europeans came with that mentality, even the Arabs themselves before, with the mentality of superior civilization, culture, religions, and even superior physiology and intelligence. And they thought they were vested with the noble mission to conquer Africa and civilize and propagate their values amongst the colonized people of Africa. The Europeans used terms like wild, savage, uncivilized to describe Africans. And actually, this perception of Africa has continued to the present day, which made somebody like the young Nigerian writer, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, to decry what she calls today the single story that is emanating from the Western powers that colonized Africa. How was the mind colonized and conditioned? Well, it's a technique, a whole technique that was in place, which used methods like torture, humiliation, brainwashing, racial segregation and racism amongst African populations, particularly Black African populations, and their diaspora scattered all over in Americas, Europe, etc., other parts of the world, particularly through the slave trade. By the time independence started coming to African nations in the 1950s, of course, colonization and the conditioning of the minds of Africans had already eaten very deep into the collective and individual psyche of the African populations. We, in fact, must praise our fathers of independence, or what some people still say is a so-called independence, because it's not yet complete. The fathers of independence of Africa, for their courage and the role they played in, getting out of this mental colonization and trying to mobilize people and give people the confidence that they should be able to own up their destinies. And that led to the independence struggle later that gave us the independence in many parts of Africa as from the 1950s. Well, the European colonizers approached colonization in two ways that I think most of us know. We learned that in our history lessons in the secondary school. The countries like Britain used direct rule in their colonies, like Nigeria, Ghana, etc. That is, they are leveraging on the existing traditional governance structures, and use that. That they used indirect rule. The British leveraging on the traditional governance structures. That is indirect rule. Now, it was basically Britain that was the main protagonist of that approach. The others were mainly France, Belgium, and other countries like Spain and Portugal, they were using the direct rule. And that means they actually tried to settle in their colonies and rule these colonies at all the strata of administration. They had control over everything. So, well, I try to look at these two approaches, indirect rule as practiced by Great Britain and direct rule by the other colonizing powers. And the question that it raises is, which one did a greater harm to Africa in terms of colonizing the minds of the people? Well, of course, many people would want to say the French approach, which was the direct rule, or Belgium, which colonized countries like Rwanda, Burundi, etc., Congo, Kinshasa, were more, let me say, they went to, this approach went to a greater extent in colonizing the minds of people. That is an argument, of course, it's a debate that is on, and everybody might have an opinion on that. Now, when we look at the issue of decolonizing the minds, it looks like Africa is lagging behind many continents, many regions of the world that also suffered colonization. If you look at Asia and even Latin America, you will see that they have made tremendous progress in trying to get out of the colonization of their minds. Africa has a difficult situation because of the length of the experience of colonization, which totals several centuries, of course, because you have to include the period of the slave trade. That makes it easier for the northern part of Africa, which didn't suffer the slave trade directly, to, let me say, emancipate itself a bit more than the Black African side. So the countries like the Maghrebian countries, Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, have a greater extent of decolonization of the minds of their people than Black Africa, the way I see it. Now, in the approach that I also took, of course, I want to emphasize that the Black African experience is actually a very complicated one because of the slave trade. Now, what are the forms and ramifications of this colonization of the mind? Well, we can look at it from the level of our leadership, our government, and we could easily see that our leaders don't seem to grasp the stakes involved in the decolonization issues. Well, there is an objective reason for that. Africa was partitioned and along arbitrary borders, and we are still having challenges with national cohesion. Economic transformation and infrastructure development becomes a little bit difficult. African leaders are looking outwards for solutions to development, which is a manifestation of colonial mentality that the leadership is still suffering. We saw it recently with Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, just inviting all the African countries to France to come and discuss the financing of development in Africa. So it's still a way of France to continue holding that umbilical cord that it has with African countries. We saw it in the way Emmanuel Macron and Alassane Ouattara, the president of Ivory Coast, kind of came together and unilaterally hijacked, let me use that pretty undiplomatic word, the Eco-Common Currency project that was put together by ECOWAS. And I couldn't understand why a president of an African country would, to that extent, allow France to dictate what to do to him. Well, this is the kind of problem we do have at the level of leadership. The leadership is not very conscious of the challenge of decolonization. Then, so the decolonization is a big issue in all the strata of African societies today. It has permeated our culture, the behavior, our way of life, etc. We are actually more comfortable most of the time wearing attires that are imported from our colonial powers and eating foods and drinks, etc. And we had a conversation some time back on OAI platform, even looking at the issue of African women or women of African descent, whether in Africa or outside, getting too much into wearing hairstyles, with attachments, with artificial hair, imitating their Caucasian counterparts, and some of them also indulging in skin lightening programs, just changing the color of their skin. So these are manifestations at individual and society levels that we see of the colonization. So how do we handle this? For me to conclude, at least with some ideas, we need to increase the sense of Africanness. I'm looking up at something that we all witnessed in many decades back, when somebody like James Brown came out with a very popular song, "I Am Black and Proud." This is the kind of concept, this is the kind of approach, this is the active, proactive approach that we need from Africa. We need the role, is an increasing role of the media to be more African-centered. Our music and film industries are playing already a very major role. I think Tim mentioned that. Sports organizations too. We were talking of, Africa being more interested, for example, in the sports happening overseas rather than what is happening on our continent. The football tournaments in Britain with Chelsea and all that. So we need to do a conscious effort to come back to take interest in what is happening in our country. Nigeria is doing very well, just like Kenya and Egypt, etc., that are promoting African film industry. And above all, we need to take a good look, a very critical look at our educational system and see how we can overhaul the pedagogical content of our academic programs so that the teaching of courses like history, geography, African literature, and civic education, among others, can be strengthened. Nigeria, for example, is giving us a lot of concern because we hear that the teaching of history has been relegated to the background. Let me also touch a little bit on what Professor Ochefu has already said about the economic independence as a way to conclude. Of course, we need that reinforcement of Africa's economic independence. We probably have a political independence that is not even very well asserted, but most of all, we need economic independence, and this is very, very possible with the resources that we are endowed with. So we need to do that by looking at how we can look inwards to derive resources from Africa rather than looking all the time towards international donors, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, etc., to look for solutions to the financing of our development. And that, of course, creates a framework for neo-colonization of Africa, which was mentioned by Tim. And that is where our leaders of today will need to stand up and rise to the challenge, like the fathers of our independence did when they rose up to the challenge of our domination and our colonization, and sometimes at the risk of their lives, to liberate African continent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. It's quite enlightening. This conversation of decolonization, for me, I think it's the, what's the word now? It's the hub that will drive every other thing that concerns the African continent. Look at it this way: you talked about we talked about the African music, we talked about the African movies, we talked about the progress we have made. But really, if you look at what we are putting out, it seems like even in our music and movies, which is we say is globally acclaimed, we are trying as much as possible to appear Western. You say Africans are producing music. Look at the musical videos. Look at the ideas. Are they really African, or it's the African trying to be very Western but using the African beat and rhythm to gain entrance into the Western market? So yes, the world has accepted our music and our movies, but what's the content? What's the messaging? Does it sell the African value, or it's still trying to be Western? Look at the typical Nigerian movie that we saw. It's very, look at the setting. Does it reflect Africa? Our music, does it reflect our culture? Yeah, Africans are winning Grammy and all that stuff, but what's the message behind the music? If we take our own message, will the world accept it? And I think this issue of decolonization of the mind, I think it has, like you rightly said, we need to come back to our education, our educational institutions. Socialization in every society begins, it's a form of education. So if we don't get it right from when the child is born and he goes through secondary school, what are the values he's taught? Is it taught to feel that, for you to, if a banker comes to you and he's wearing what I'm wearing now, would we take him serious? He has to appear Western, he has to wear a suit. If your pastor comes to church and is dressed like Tim, how seriously do we take him? So these are part of the issues we have to deal with, because in our mind, if he's not wearing a suit, he has not heard from God. If he's not dressed wearing Western suit, are we sure that he knows when he's talking finance? Are we sure he knows what he's talking about? So this whole thing has to, I think it comes back to our socialization process. What values are we teaching? So we can go around and around and talk about the economic and all that stuff until we address the mind thing. Issues of economic dominance and all that stuff will still persist. So I would like to pause here, and Tim wants to chip in something.
Thank you very much, Professor Igah, for a beautiful presentation. I wanted to look at the issue of language vis-a-vis your paper on decolonizing the mind. When I went through the pages of history, and I realized that most of the countries that are actually doing great things, language is very crucial. When you see the Chinese people, as we speak today, we have about 56 different ethnic groups in China, but they are united by one language, which is Chinese. When the Jewish people came together from all over the world, they came with different languages, some Russian, some English, some Arab, so different languages, until they realized that they have to rewrite their own language, which is Hebrew. So today they are united by that singular language, which is Hebrew. So when you see the Caucasians, it's the English that unites them together. But for us, here we are today on this platform, the means of communication is still English. Do you think language has a role to play in decolonizing our minds? And if yes, how do you think we can begin to take a positive step? Because in 1963, when our forefathers started OAU, there are some difficult questions. There are a lot of about 5 questions on their plate, but there are some difficult questions they didn't answer. One of the difficult questions is about the redrawn of the boundaries. They escaped that. They didn't answer that. The second difficult question was about the language issue. They also escaped that. But for how long do you think we can continue to escape answering our difficult question? For me, don't you think if we put a Swahili, which is spoken by 10% of Africans today, and about 15 African countries today, don't you think if we promote a language like it's totally indigenous to Africa, which is Swahili, which is the most popular language spoken today across African countries, And if that is yes, going by what Professor Ochefu first said, when he says that if we continue to rely on government to do something, we may probably have to wait till the end of time. Then what do you think organizations like OAI can do to actually spearhead the adoption of a common African language? Thank you once again for your brilliant presentation.
Prof, before you answer that, Chris he has something else he wants to add to this this basket of questions.
Okay, Prof, thank you for your exposition, and I was intrigued by the historical background you put to it, especially the fact that, like you said, virtually every part of the world has at one time or the other been colonized. The challenge for me, one thing that I've never really been able to understand, is whether there's something about the African that makes us susceptible to accepting everything foreign. Why do I ask this question? Like you said, every part of the world has been colonized. The India was colonized, but they didn't lose their culture. Japan was colonized by the Americans after the Second World War. They didn't lose their culture, essence, or language. And the same is true for virtually every part of the world outside of Africa. But coming home, the English colonized large parts of Africa. France did the same. And till today, we still see the influence of English, French, European culture, very dominant in our continent, which is not the story you find in other parts of the world. So the question for me is simple. Do we know if there's something about the African that makes it easy for him to accept everything foreign and to discard everything that is his own? And if we do know that these things exist, how do we then rewind the clock to the point where we are then able to resolve these historical imbalances and make the African prouder of his culture, of his background, of his language? Thank you.
I think, well, let me just share my thoughts on these two very well structured questions that actually come to complete the presentation I made, but at the same time, they are questions. So, well, John's was a remark. Tim's own was a question. And Chris is also coming with a very interesting question. The question Tim asked took me back to my younger days in the primary school in Nigeria. And I remember that the teaching of Nigerian languages in the I'm talking about primary school. The teaching of Nigerian languages was in our curriculum. My language in Nigeria is the Benue State language called Idoma. And Idoma was in our curriculum in the primary school. But at the same time, you had three other major languages that are actually the major languages of Nigeria: Hausa, Igbo, and Yoruba. They were being taught in the primary school. And in fact, they added, because of the Hausa-Fulani connection, they added the Fulani to the Hausa part. And I can tell you, when I came out of primary school, I was able to manage at least some, conversational level of any of those languages. I could travel and start opening up the conversation, at least in any of those languages. Up till today, I can manage some Hausa, for example. And this is something that I think we can translate at the continental level. You talked about Swahili, and it's actually a language that is very widely spoken in Eastern Africa, East and Central Africa. But there are other languages too competing with Swahili. There's a language like Lingala of the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is in fact is gaining more traction at the international level because of the music of the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example. So we do have those two languages from that part of Africa. We have, on the western part of Africa, we have another major language. And some people say it's even the language that is most spoken by Africans as an African language, and that is Hausa language, which is spoken in northern part of Nigeria, and many other Nigerians are speaking Hausa. You go to Niger Republic, etc., and other parts of Togo, Hausa is there. So the question is, what do we adopt? What do we adopt? It's very difficult, and it's very complicated to try to impose something from the top, like from African Union level. But I think what OAI can do is to try to bring that awareness in the various countries. So the need for us to start by promoting the teaching of key African languages in the various countries. They say a journey of even 1,000 miles must start with the first step. So we may not go to the end of the journey immediately, but we could start like teaching Swahili in Nigeria, teaching Lingala in Nigeria, teaching probably Yoruba in Democratic Republic of Congo. I can tell you that the Institute of Oriental Languages in Paris is teaching Yoruba, Hausa, and Igbo to people here. You see, so this is something the colonial power that is France sees as an opportunity for them, because they are coming to Africa and they are doing that with Lingala and Swahili and other African languages. When the French are sending diplomats to Africa, they will find diplomats that speak the different languages of the countries where they are going to. So let me just stop there because of time. We need to just start getting African countries interested in the teaching of other African languages, key African languages within their countries, and that OAI can try to spur that action. Regarding the question on what happens and why Africans are like too open to other cultures, I would say the answer is simply the historical background that I just described. When you compare with Japan, with India, all those countries, I think African continent, Black Africa, is the only part of the world that has had that long history, 500 years or 400 years of slavery and colonization, during which a lot of damage was done to our individual and collective psyche. Foreign languages imposed on us, and religions imposed on us, and education was imposed on us, which is also the Western education. So all this is something that we will find we will need time to go gradually to bring that awareness at different levels in the African societies to the need for our children. We have to leverage on education. It's not because we are biologically constituted that way to open up to other cultures. It is because of our history. And that history, we can change it. The impact of that history, we can change it gradually through education. And that education has to start even at the primary level. Thank you.
Prof, that's quite educative. This conversation will continue even after this session. I'm sure it's something that is very topical. It's something that whose time has come. We really need to dig deeper into this conversation. At this point, we will take a minute break for us to stretch our legs, grab our drinks, and just generally craft our questions. When we come back, we'll be taking Richard Akinyemi Izeagu. Now, name sounds complicated, but Richard is an African American who sees himself more of an African than an American. So he's adopted the African tradition and African, he's reconnected with his African roots by adopting African names. So we'll be taking his, he'll be sharing his experience with us when we return. Thank you.